Okay, folks, I think we'll get started. So as you know, this is a special council meeting for our strategic session, and we have two items on the agenda, participatory budgeting and then the development incentives for affordable housing. Following that, we do need to have a caucus session on two items that staff have advised us of, and so we'll need to waive notice and then motion to go into camera, and we'll do that at the end of this session. So welcome everybody, and we will begin with our participatory budgeting piece, and I think Mr. Hagee is going to provide some introductory comments.
Sure.
Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council. I'm just going to make a few very brief introductory comments, and then we have our associates here from the University of Waterloo who will be taking the balance of the presentation. So I am pleased to be here this afternoon to introduce participatory budgeting to council for discussion. As part of the 2015 business plan prioritization process, participatory budgeting, or PB as you may hear it referred to today, was ranked 16th out of 103 potential strategic action items, and it's been reflected in both the 2016 and 2017 council-approved business plans. The city's been fortunate to find a willing partner in the University of Waterloo to help with the research, development, and implementation of PB here in Kitchener. Representatives from the University of Waterloo will be making a brief presentation. So you can see on the slide the people that will be here. You'll see Sean Goby on the left. He's actually not here today. He's had a child, or his wife has had a child recently, so he's unable to be here today. But Norman Kearney will be taking the presentation, and Sean Campbell is also here as part of the research team. They'll be making a brief presentation, then facilitating the discussion, and there were 4 questions in the report that we're really going to ask for some direction of council today. There was a handout that I have provided that talks about ranking, so when it comes to the right time, when we get to question number 1, we'll be looking for some direction from council as to what this should look like. Finally, the feedback that we receive here today from council will be used to shape what PB in Kitchener looks like, what the pilot projects are, where we go, and this will be a coordinated effort between city staff and the University of Waterloo. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll turn the rest of the presentation time over to Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council, members of staff, for this opportunity to address you today and to share some of the first-hand knowledge I have of participatory budgeting, translating it from Hamilton, where I was involved, here into the city of Kitchener. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo in social and ecological sustainability theory, and I initiated the participatory budgeting process in Hamilton's Ward 2 and ran it for its first year. I've also spoken on participatory budgeting at international conferences in Denmark and in the United States. I've observed participatory budgeting in action in several American cities, and I've been recently involved in advising some other Canadian cities such as Kingston. Here with me is also Sean Campbell. Sean Campbell was involved in Sustainable Waterloo, and he is a consultant working with nonprofits, charities, and municipalities, and he's a core part of our research team as well. So, participatory budgeting doesn't exactly sound exciting. Actually, it sounds kind of dreadful. It's 9 hard-to-pronounce syllables, and we've been searching in vain for a better way of describing it for years. But for now, we stick with participatory budgeting. And the simple idea is get more people involved in making decisions about the allocation of public resources. Now, why on earth would you want to do that? I'm going to try and share with you some of the exciting things that come out of making that decision in a moment, but just want to highlight some of why are we here as researchers. We're particularly interested in how different mechanisms for making decisions satisfy the participants. So does participatory budgeting lead to a more satisfactory experience for citizens of participating in their democracy? And how does participating in this way shape the way that people look at their city, understand their own community, and contribute to it? So we have a number of design questions at each stage of the process, and we're looking at setting up a couple or a few micro-PB experiments that would allow us to test different variations of the process. How could this benefit the City of Kitchener? Well, Kitchener and the region are already recognized as essentially the Silicon Valley of the North, a place of innovation and exciting new developments. That is obvious on the tech side. There are also some really impressive work being done on the social innovation side. I know there's a governance lab and other initiatives on this side. Participatory budgeting is an opportunity to also boost the amount of social innovation going on involving both the community and the city. So, yes, next slide. So participatory budgeting, this is a definition that's used in the literature quite often. It's a mechanism by which the population defines the destination or part or totality of public resources. Participatory budgeting is not new. It began in 1989 in Porto Alegre, Brazil, a country that was just coming out of two decades of military dictatorship. And participatory budgeting was introduced as part of a wave of new democratization efforts in Brazil. It has been going on in Brazil since then, uninterrupted. And at the height of the process, as much as 10% of the city budget was allocated directly by residents through community assemblies, in collaboration with the expertise of city staff and city council. That spread to hundreds of cities in Latin America and to dozens of countries around the world and has recently begun to make inroads into North America. Guelph was the first city in North America, and that was a citywide participatory budgeting process. Toronto Community Housing Corporation has used it, maybe a potential future participatory budgeting voter over there in the corner. Chicago, New York are major American cities where PB is well in swing. In New York, there are, I think, 20 districts that each allocate $1 to $2 million to participatory budgeting. One case that's not listed there is the first American citywide participatory budget, which is Vallejo, California. So participatory budgeting really simply has three main stages. The first is generating ideas. The second is discussing, vetting, reviewing, considering those ideas, and the final is making decisions. Now, this is a process that you're all quite familiar with, that you do it every year with the budget yourselves. The difference is expanding the number of people that are involved in the process. That's where things get tricky. The way that we often do that in participatory budgeting is through neighborhood assemblies. Sometimes we'll work through a neighborhood association. Many of those are already in existence. They're an ideal candidate to partner with. Other times we'll set up new bodies, maybe a youth group that will advise on how some of the funding will be spent. More recent participatory budgets have used online consultation methods. So maybe there's an online RFP and residents can submit their idea, or they can drop it off in a ballot box at the local library. In any case, there's lots of different input mechanisms that you can consider. Following that, there's usually a round of face-to-face meetings with citizens, and crucially, there's a moment where those ideas, which often are the product of blue sky thinking, are brought to city staff for their expert advice on feasibility and potential cost. And that information sharing that then goes back to residents is a really crucial part of the process. It helps people learn about what it really takes to make their vision a reality. And so it can improve relationships between the city because residents get a first-hand vested interest in understanding how things are done and what it takes. Another component is usually site visits. So often residents will go and look at the places where these projects could actually end up occurring. And then finally a vote. And I'll give you an example of all of these things by going to the case of Hamilton in just a moment. The last thing I'll say, though, is implementation and monitoring is usually done by the city, but it's very important to see participatory budgeting as a cyclical process and not as a linear one. It's not a process that has a clear start and finish. It is always feeding into the next round. So it's important to maintain trust and to maintain the faith of the public in this process, that there's a reporting on the projects that were voted for. Where's my project at? Have there been any problems that need to be troubleshooted? Where are we going from here? Otherwise, you can get people who had their hopes lifted and they don't have an explanation about why. Perhaps there's been a delay and they could end up losing interest in actually closing off from public engagement altogether. So seeing the process as cyclical, as kind of having a constant loop of information is very important in terms of its sustainability. Some of the questions that we're going to ask your input on today are what your priorities are when it comes to participatory budgeting. Is it about increasing community engagement? Is it about education of government processes? Is it about improved accountability and trust, increased effectiveness and engagement, promotion of cooperation and social justice? These are all things that participatory budgeting can do, but whether it does it is really a matter of the resources that you put into the process and the design choices that you make going into it. Pictures speak louder than words, so I want to show you some. In Hamilton, we took $1 million out of the capital budget and we allocated it to participatory budgeting in Ward 2, which is the downtown ward. It's a ward of a population of about 44,000 people. It's very diverse. Hamilton is one of the top immigrant ports of call in Canada. And there are a number of different ethnic communities in the downtown, as well as a wide range of income levels. So for us, it was a really good place to test participatory budgeting's potential to bring together different groups and get them working together towards shared goals. We organized the participatory budgeting process into 8 assemblies. 5 of them were regional, 3 of them were cultural or thematic. There was an assembly for the Chinese community, which is the largest ethnic group in downtown Hamilton, an assembly for the Somali community, which is the second largest ethnic group in downtown Hamilton, and a youth assembly to engage youth. And the other 5 were based on historical named neighborhood boundaries. And we asked each of these assemblies to generate some ideas. Those ideas we brought to city staff for their consideration. We brought the information back to the assemblies from staff, and we asked residents to shortlist their ideas. After they had done that, we could have gone straight to a vote, but we decided instead to have each assembly choose a delegate. And these people on the PowerPoint right now are some of those delegates. And the problem we posed to the delegates was, okay, staff have told us there's $2 million worth of ideas based on what has come forward. We only have $1 million to allocate. We could just go and vote on it, but maybe we can find ways to work together and find some win-win compromises. And that's the challenge we gave them. We gave them 5 meetings. There was a meeting every week for just over a month, and we did a bus tour where we actually chartered a city bus, mapped out a walk and a driving tour, and each delegate was empowered with 30 to 45 minutes to showcase their favorite proposals from their community. Now, at the start of this process, all of the delegates were competitive. They came to the first meeting and I asked them, can you please tell me, because they had a list of all the projects from all the communities, can you please tell me a project from your community that you're very proud of? And can you highlight one from another community that you think is worthy, that is really interesting? Well, as we went around the circle, everyone was able to champion a project from their community and no one was able to even name a project from another one. But by the end of the process of bringing the delegates together, they had come to a $1 million consensus agreement, which they took back to their assemblies and they advocated, and their assemblies bought into. And we put that forward as one of the options. You could vote on the menu of all the options, choose your own, or you could vote for this recommendation that came out through this deliberation, this compromise and consensus building exercise. The woman on the left who you see who's raising her arm is Lisa Wang. She was the delegate for the Chinese community. And she is showing the team of delegates, there's about 10 of them there, her vision for a Chinese cultural garden on the waterfront in Hamilton. She knows, or she told us, that every year about 1 million Chinese tourists drive from Toronto to Niagara Falls to see the falls, and they never stop in Hamilton. And she thought, well, why don't we build something to attract Chinese tourists and market it? And that's exactly what she proposed, and she had her project funded. What I like about this example is that Lisa Wang does not work for the tourism department. She's an ordinary citizen who had an extraordinary idea that was unlocked because we went to her and said, tell us how you can make our community better. It has economic development benefits. It could bring more tourists to the city. And it also helped a community see more of itself reflected in the neighborhood. There was a bit of snag, though. Lisa's project was going to cost a lot more than it was funded for. She was funded for $10,000, but her project probably would have cost closer to $100,000 to complete. She was not deterred. She went around and she raised support in kind. She raised $70,000. She partnered with a local construction firm that donated equipment and construction workers who donated their labor, community organizations and universities and colleges which donated benches and plants, and brought the community together to help actually build this garden. And when all was said and done, she had mobilized dozens and dozens of people to provide their labor, and there was a beautiful festival and celebration of this new garden. It's called the Sunset Cultural Garden. It's got a great Facebook page if you want to see. And they turned it into not just a Chinese cultural garden, but a multicultural garden, because she realized she needed more support than just her own community. And there were people from different cultural groups putting on different dances. There was cuisine from all different cultural groups. There were city officials and members of the community all celebrating. So again, just another example of the indirect benefits of participatory budgeting. The woman on the right is the Somali delegate representing her community. She's 16 years old. One of the best practices in participatory budgeting is to include all residents in the process, and not just citizens, and to have a lower participation age than is customary for elections. So in Hamilton, it was 14 years of age, and on the voting day, which is on the next slide, we had many 14-year-olds casting their ballots. The way we deployed the voting, we had 3 stationary polls, and then we rented 6 vans, and we had teams going around the neighborhoods. My philosophy was, if an ice cream truck can come down your road, so can local democracy. And so these were essentially ice cream trucks for participatory budgeting. We had 1,024 residents vote, which came out to just under 4% of the eligible voters, 14 and up, which is pretty consistent with the participation rate in North American cities for participatory budgeting. And residents chose the package of $1 million worth of projects that had been put forward by the community delegates. So from that point on, there were 21 projects that were funded. Among them was a grant for a local food program. This community group puts food in the backpacks of students during recess. These students are identified by the principals. And this is a way of avoiding stigma for students who might need assistance meeting a healthy diet. There's no public way that takes place, so there was a great example. Push-button activated crosswalks were funded, and the cultural garden is another example. So there's a mix of sort of social infrastructure, physical improvements to neighborhoods, and cultural projects as well. So once again, I'm just going to put this up so you have kind of a view of what the process normally entails. You again see a linear process here, but I think it's very helpful to think about it in a cyclical way. And I don't want to say much more at this time, and what we'd like to do is turn it over to you for discussion, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have on these 3 questions. In your opinion, what are the most important outcomes of PB pilots? What population segments should be targeted in the participatory budgeting pilot? How many pilots will be undertaken, and what do reasonable timelines look like for delivery? We've already showed you these as the possible outcomes: community engagement, government processes, accountability and trust, effectiveness and engagement, cooperation and social justice. I've mentioned some of the ways that you could organize the inputs into the process, which is along geographic lines, economic profile, neighborhood need, establish neighborhood associations, and consideration of other projects being undertaken, for example, your neighborhood strategies. How many pilots? We would recommend more than 1, potentially up to 4. This would allow different methods of delivery to be tested and then improved on in subsequent years. The way that PB is often done in cities is a model is introduced, and it's just that's the model that's used indefinitely. And by taking a more experimental approach, we can identify some strategies for really making participatory budgeting work best for Kitchener. Reasonable timelines, we've talked about this as staff and the UW group. I think that this could start as early as summer 2017, although it really will depend on the design considerations and could be longer depending on the potential design. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Norm and Sean, who I guess is there for moral support. So at this point, I think what we'll do is we'll take any questions from council, and then we'll come back and get council's input onto those 4 questions that you have of us going forward. So questions of council. Councillor Ioannidis.
Thank you, Mayor Romanovich, and thank you, Norman, and for your presentation. In your presentation, you stated you were involved with developing participatory budgeting in Hamilton. And when I look in our package, I see the participatory budgeting that was happening in Hamilton, that there was conflicts. Can you elaborate what those conflicts were?
Yeah, sorry. And if you guys can just keep your mics on, that would be great.
Thank you, Councillor Ioannidis.
Yes.
Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Mayor. Conflict is an inevitable and not at all times a negative part of change. And in Hamilton, we were introducing something that was very disruptive to the way that I think councillors saw themselves as being the final decision makers on things, and staff who are the experts who many years have been advising on how money should be spent and how projects should be approached. So some of the conflicts, looking back on participatory budgeting in Ward 2, I think were to do with the way that we were accelerating forward with a very different way of doing things and not really giving everyone a lot of time to adjust. What I think is very positive about the way things have been proposed here is this has already been discussed with staff, among council. It already has political support. We were coming at it from the outside. And that there's an incremental approach being considered here where small amounts of money are being tested in a couple of different ways. And I think that will help identify any potential friction between different departments, between the community and the city, and avoid any sort of repeat of conflicts we saw in Hamilton.
Okay. With your participation there in Hamilton, I guess, because that's your only experience besides reading through other studies, correct?
It's my only experience running a participatory budget or designing one, but I'm plugged into the participatory budgeting network of scholars and practitioners around the world. I've observed a number of them in practice, and I've been advising other cities on how they can develop their participatory budget.
Good.
I also wrote my master's thesis on participatory budgeting.
Based on all of that experience and your knowledge and being on advisory, what is the number one issue that you're facing with among members of council or among residents?
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Could you be a bit more specific about challenge facing? Because there's a variety of challenges. I mean, as I said, this is a very different way of doing things, and there's a lot of learning that is done through experience.
It is a big difference in the way of doing things, and my biggest concern is how do you have accountability? That's my biggest concern, because this seems like it's a very ambitious project, and I want to know how, if something goes wrong, who's accountable besides the people here? Because we're the ones that will face the criticism. So I want to know who's accountable if something goes wrong.
Thank you, Mr. Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with the councillor's statement that ultimately it is council that is responsible for the final allocation of the budget. In terms of accountability, that is a very legitimate concern to have, especially when we're talking about your fiduciary responsibility with respect to public funds. And it's a worry that's shared by councillors in virtually every city that I've seen do participatory budgeting. Are people going to run off with this money and use it irresponsibly? And what I think the evidence shows is that that problem is not reflected in practice. What you have is usually a number of people, not just one or a small group, but a number of different groups of people all meeting to discuss this. And just as and common sense tends to prevail. In Hamilton, we never even had a case where there was a bizarre project that was completely implausible or irresponsible, in my judgment. Now, accountability, I think, is actually built into the process itself. It's a public process where people need to state and make a case publicly. They have to convince their neighbors, and they have to live with the consequences. You know, often we're talking about making improvements to a local park. Your children might be playing in that park, or your neighbor's children might be playing in that park. So communities hold themselves accountable for a lot of these things. I sat in meetings in Hamilton where residents were debating how to use the funds, and a bad idea was nipped in the bud very quickly because people realized that resources are scarce, and we want to use this to maximize the benefit for our children and for ourselves.
Okay, I'll click in after again, let other members have their say. My time's up.
Okay,
Thank you.
Councillor Singh.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and my apologies for having to eat around the horseshoe. I hadn't had opportunity to eat lunch, so this was my only chance. Really, it was interesting read going through the report, and of course the information you presented through your delegation. Like Councillor Ioannidis, I share some concerns, and I think we have to be cautious leading up because this is a very drastic way of doing things. The question was asked, aspect of accountability. So my concern is similar but still further to that, aspect of accountability of one neighborhood may very well be supportive of this initiative where there may not be citywide support for something like that. It may be considered just frivolous spending. You referenced two different community groups that demographically represented. How do you weigh which one gets support? Is there a cause for concern that you're pitting people against each other? There could be that type of perception as well. Can you elaborate on some of those concerns?
Thank you, Mr. Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. In a way, that's exactly what happens at council. Each of you has a district, each of you has a ward, a set of constituents you're accountable to. And yet you find a way to find compromises and work together to advance something that is good, not only for your constituents, but for the whole. Now, the difference between you and a member of the general public is you have a lot more experience at that. And this is one way where people learn very fast that they need to play nice in the same sandbox. Another way that you kind of anticipate those problems is by having conversations right from the beginning about what is important to our different communities. And so what is often done is what is called a matrix is created of social and social justice requirements, where people have an opportunity to identify what they think this budget should be allocated from the outset. The other thing is, as I mentioned, we did the bus tour, and we brought delegates together from different communities. One thing I didn't mention in my delegation was there was a delegate from one of the more affluent neighborhoods and a delegate from the least affluent neighborhood in the ward. And I overheard them speaking, and the delegate from the more affluent community was saying, I had no idea that our neighborhoods actually had so much in common. And I didn't know that there was so much interesting stuff going on in this neighborhood. So participatory budgeting is a vehicle for communities learning about each other's needs.
So I appreciate everything that you said. There's a lot of benefit, but there's a lot of stumbling blocks along the way. And I think that's where we really have to determine, are those stumbling blocks sufficient or beneficial for our community to ultimately get that benefit that's derived through participatory budgeting process.
That's the biggest stumbling block, is the word.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear your answer.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just making a joke. I said that's the biggest stumbling block is the word participatory budgeting.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. Yeah, there you go. Sorry, I lost my track of thought. Where was I going with this? You said something about accountability. One aspect of accountability that we all have is we have a very innate desire to serve our community, but we are only able to serve in the capacity that we do because we're appointed, elected by our citizens. It's very different there. So it is messy around this horseshoe as well, but we try to work through it and try to continue to engage ourselves in aspect of that lens of accountability, how we're seen by those that have, supported us or voted for us to be here, to be able to voice their concerns or represent their advocacy. Is there common ground with what this does and what we do now?
Thank you, Mr. Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I think participatory budgeting supplements representative democracy and does not replace it. You're very right to point out that, as the councillor is right to point out, that you are all elected members of government. And someone who comes out to a town hall meeting or to an assembly may be an individual with one particular interest, who may not be particularly keen on listening to others and is just trying to ram through their own objective. And that's where design comes into the problem. You design the process in a way that makes it difficult for any person to co-opt the process, and you have good facilitators in place who can ensure that everyone's treated fairly. And then you also need to think about how you're going to select participants. Are you going to have an open door where literally anyone can walk in and take a vote? Are you going to randomly select people in sort of a citizen jury or a citizen assembly way? There are different ways to address these different issues.
Okay, I remembered what my other question was. Do you want me to just keep back in? Or
Just ask it real quick,
okay, all right.
because I'm cognizant of overall time.
Sure, no problem. The other thing is, when you were preparing this and seeing how this could best fit our community here, did you do review or assess what we are currently doing with our neighborhood strategy right now?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we're aware of the neighborhood strategy initiative. We have not moved forward with any particular designs of the PP process at this time because we were waiting for feedback on what the design emphasis should be. But there's an opportunity here for participatory budgeting and the neighborhood strategy to work synergistically.
Well, no, that's why I asked, because there's already, from reading the report and seeing our neighborhood strategy, commonalities of that's the direction we're heading already. But anyways, I'll ring back in for comment.
Mr. May, you wanted to add something here? Go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, only to confirm that both myself and Darren Croft from the Neighborhood Strategy Team have been on the project team working on this. And as Councillor Singh noted, we do see very strong synergies between the two bodies of work.
But Mr. Chapman, maybe you can clarify as well, because there's been some direction around this already. And so maybe you can just provide clarity around what direction council has given and what specifically we're asking for today.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, as Mr. Hagee alluded to, back in 2015, Council prioritized this on the list of strategic initiatives. I believe it was number 16 out of 103, and on that basis included it in its approved business plan. So we already have Council direction on this project. Today's discussion really is about the how, not the what.
Okay. Councillor Fernandez, you're next.
Thank you. Sorry, your name just went right out of my head. I apologize.
Norm.
Norm, thank you. So I mean, I definitely saw the synergies and the cross-pollination opportunities between the neighborhood strategies and what you're doing here. And I love that you talked about how it worked out within Hamilton, because I think you've set a really good precedent there. So when you're talking about how staff worked with the residents, were they able to separate what they maybe saw as a project and what the residents saw as a project?
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. That is a crucial part of the problem. And the way that we addressed that was we set up something called the PB office, and that was a community-led group of volunteers, and I was at the center of that. The projects that came in from the residents, we organized them, and then we sat down with city staff and worked through those projects to have them assigned to different departments for review. And then we had a point person on the city side. And once all that review came back, we vetted it to see if there were any misunderstandings and if there was complete information from our perspective in terms of what residents needed. And we found that that was very helpful for both parties because it created a buffer between residents and staff. People who don't have any experience doing this might expect things, as I said, to move very fast, and they might not understand why they're getting some resistance. So having that buffer of volunteers between staff and between residents kind of, I think, makes the process smoother for everyone. Okay. But it also sorted out the different perspectives that people might bring to the
right, and you're right that it is challenging, and I think we all, as councillors and as management staff, and I've spoken to our deputy CEO just recently about how it is always an education to try and get people to understand that what they want to happen and how it processes out can take a longer time. You had some really great examples of the fact that there were there were 21 projects, right, awarded? Is that what I said? You said?
There were 31 choices and 21 were awarded.
Right, okay. But when you gave the example of somebody from the affluent neighborhood speaking with somebody from a lesser affluent neighborhood, I think this is so critical because that happens so often where people don't. I hear this all the time. I pay very high taxes, and my question is, so you think you should get servicing more than somebody who pays lower taxes because their house value or their land value is less? Did you see that as being a great catalyst for understanding and compassion when the 21 projects were awarded?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if I understand correctly, the question is, was there by the end of this process a kind of shift in the way that people saw things?
Yes.
Yes, I think so. The project that was being talked about between those two delegates actually was about fixing up an alleyway that in Hamilton has been pejoratively nicknamed Listerine Alleyway. The neighborhood that wanted to turn this alleyway into an urban trail, which would have artists decorate it with murals, it would be paved with semi-permeable pavement, it would have lighting installed and hanging gardens and baskets. The resident from the other neighborhood had no idea that there was such a blight in that area of the neighborhood. And that project is what really turned it around. Walking through on that bus tour and that walking tour we did is what really turned things around for the delegate from the wealthier neighborhood. And that person went back to their own community and tried to get everyone on board to understand, like, they have this dilapidated alleyway where there are often drug deals taking place, there are syringes discarded there are people sleeping in it at times. Can we find ways to not only beautify this, but make it safer for the residents in the neighborhood too?
Okay, so my next question is kind of a two-parter because I'm looking at my time. Will you be following through with, like, if we say yes, and I really hope we do, because I think this is the next step to making sure that the neighborhood strategy and the public engagement, all the work that we've been doing that's kind of led up to a culmination of more citizen engagement, including participatory budgeting. Will you be working with our staff, and where would the facilitators that you said good facilitators are important, where would they come from?
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. So I'm a research assistant for Dr. Sean Goby. I'm around as long as he wants me to be here. And I believe that we'll be working closely with staff on this project, both design and implementation. And whether we ourselves are involved in facilitating it or we have a role in helping select the facilitators is, for me, an open question at this time.
Mr. Hagee, you want to add something to that?
Sure. Through Mr. Mayor, we've contemplated, we do want the University of Waterloo staff to continue on through it as they have more experience with this. We have engaged in the CSD area. If we're talking about youth and neighborhoods, we have staff in those areas that work directly with those, so we're looking to leverage them in whatever we move forward with.
Okay, thank you. I have probably 20 more minutes of questions, but I'll let others ask.
Okay. I just want to remind everyone as you ask your questions that the purpose of the session today is also for you to provide input, and we're going to run out of time to provide input if people keep using all the time to ask all the questions, because we have one other item to cover off today. Councillor Yanetsky.
Thank you for your presentation. Having read the report, listening to all the comments that are taking place last little short several minutes, when I looked at the title, Participatory Budgeting, it got me thinking like budget time, really, at council meeting when we look at the annual budget, and I'm thinking like how much participation would the public be involved in, and how much desire do they have? Because when I look at the last budget meeting we just had back a month or two ago, there's nobody in the audience there. I mean, there's a handful of groups and organizations that are looking for handouts and more support, but for general public, there's nobody. Budget day, there was nobody on the final day. Public open house, we had maybe half a dozen people asking for some handouts here or there, and that's basically it. So, and I'm thinking, will the public really be engaged in this? I don't know. I'm seeing you're looking at groups, neighborhood associations and stuff like that, which is something different than I see like a budget thing overall the city. I don't know. I'm just maybe have an answer to that?
Happy to. Through you, Mr. Mayor. So, first of all, you'll never know unless you ask and you invite people to the table. But a major difference between a council meeting where council is voting on the budget and a participatory budgeting vote is that a member of the public actually has a deciding vote in the process. So you're putting money on the table that is a carrot. It gets them to the table. I can actually do something with this. I could actually shape my neighborhood with it. Whereas a council meeting where the budget's being voted on, all the planning, all the deliberations have already taken place with staff outside of council through committee meetings, and there's very little room for a resident to impact the outcome. It really relies on the rhetorical skills, right? But there's so much work that's already done. So participatory budgeting is a chance for someone to have real decision-making authority over real money. that could transform their real community. The second part was about neighborhood associations. So there's actually some mixed evidence in the literature about working through neighborhood associations. They're already organized, so they're a great partner to leverage, but there are also people who have a lot of experience, and they can sometimes be a barrier to more people getting engaged. Right? So it can end up being the neighborhood association that is really participating and not the neighborhood. So in Hamilton, we actually worked in existing neighborhood regions, but we didn't work through the association. They were a partner, but we set up our own meetings. We had our own volunteers come in and run them, and we did our own outreach efforts. And I really have to stress how important outreach efforts are. We spent 4 months knocking on doors, handing out leaflets, walking around doing public presentations, working through other community groups to get as many people interested in this as we possibly could. And neighborhood associations were a major part of that. Some of them were more enthusiastic about mobilizing people than others. But that is one thing to be mindful of, is sometimes it may be more effective to treat neighborhood associations as partners rather than providers of the process.
Well, you indicated in your first comment there that you could have some money put on a table. That's the carrot to encourage them. And you talked about doing something even this summer on this. And I'm just wondering through staff, if there's money in the budget that has already been set aside on this or not, or are we looking at something in 2018?
Through the Mayor, as identified in the report, depending on where the direction comes from Council, we would look to existing capital balances in community services or the capital contingency account to fund something as early as 2017.
Okay, I appreciate that answer. And then based on what this is happening, is there an overlap in any way to this particular participation or participatory budgeting versus what we do in Compass Kitchener in terms of its orientation with municipal government participation?
Well, actually, if I may, through you, Mr. Mayor, I was just looking at the minutes of Compass Kitchener, and there was a presentation received by Compass Kitchener back in, I think, 2007 or 9 from the Participatory Budgeting Project, which is the largest American consulting group on setting up participatory budgets. And there was a lot of interest at that meeting from the minutes in moving forward with participatory budgeting. So there, I think there's another synergy there, is to work with that already organized group of people.
Okay, thank you for your answers.
Okay, Councillor Etherington.
Through you, Mr. Chair, a couple of hopefully quick questions. Norm, I really like what you're proposing, but I share the concern with other councillors of overlap with other neighbourhood programs. In my ward alone, I could quote you a couple of projects where those projects have been funded for things like playground equipment. We're already doing that. So while I see no problem with adding to that, I would point out that we're getting involved in those kind of projects. So I wanted to ask you, my first question, you mentioned $20,000 for each pilot project. Do you think that's enough money? Because it's been my experience that there's always an underestimation with things like playground equipment as to the cost. So I would think you'd need more than $20,000 for most pilot projects.
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I mean, if you're recommending more money, that I'm all for it. But it really depends on how you frame the process. I think it's important, if you're going to do $20,000, to make clear, perhaps through some examples of what this could do, so that people don't have unrealistic expectations. It's really about managing expectations. And it depends on whether you're talking about capital or maybe program funding. So if you're looking to have residents propose ideas for community festivals or something of that nature, you could do quite a lot with $20,000 versus, capital infrastructure investments, which sometimes are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Okay, thank you. And my second question has to do with the same subject, basically money. Have you made any mention of the amount of money we would save by the use of volunteers in these projects? And, because I've seen that happening in my own ward, where people will raise money in addition to whatever comes, in this case, from the city.
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. The resources that this can mobilize can be immense. I gave you the example of the roughly $70,000 that's estimated to have been raised for that garden itself, but then there's all the time all the time that those volunteers are spending. So we had 8 assemblies with approximately 20 to 30 people coming out to them every week for, I think, 10 or 12 weeks. So you've got hundreds, at least 100 participants studying projects there. Then you have people going out and promoting them at neighborhood meetings. And then there's a value that could be placed on all the learning that citizens are doing and the way that could make governance more smoother and more effective locally as well.
I agree, and one of the other benefits, of course, would be that it might encourage more people to get out and vote in municipal elections. My final question, you mentioned, and I was puzzled by that, an example. Can you give me an example of what you mean when you say social justice? Because I can see problems with many social justice groups that would then be funded by the city.
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. There are a lot of different definitions of what social justice means. I think one example that may be uncontroversial was one of the projects in Hamilton was for a multicultural space. And as I mentioned, Ward 2 has a number of different cultural communities living in it. And there's no designated space for cultural programming apart from, say, YMCA, which is already very booked for lots of other programs. So from that perspective, a social justice aspect of that project is creating a fairer distribution of publicly available space for different groups.
And I don't have any problem with that. Thank you.
Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor Vivanovic. Norm, thank you for coming in. I really want to hear a little bit more about how you spoke about the process of how the things started out very competitive and others weren't aware of what the others' needs were, but then at the end it was kind of a unified spending plan. Could you explain a little bit more about that, how it got from the start to the finish?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. As I said, we had 5 meetings. They ran about 2 hours each. The first meeting, we had sent everyone a PDF of all the projects that had come in, and this was after they had been through a first round of vetting with city staff. So they had a project title, a description from the proponent, the resident who had proposed it. If available, we had a sort of rough cost estimate and some feasibility red flags or questions. And more information came pooling in as the process unraveled. I think it would be better to have all that information up front, but this was our first time around. At that first meeting, it was all about setting a plan for the working group. How do we want to try and move towards this shared target? There was initially a lot of skepticism about whether there even should be a shared target of getting to consensus because people were so divided. And then I mentioned how there was the exercise of everyone name something from your neighborhood, everyone name from something else. So at the second meeting, because I think people were a little bit embarrassed that they couldn't name a project from another neighborhood, everyone came back extremely well read. And we had debate, and people were talking about sort of in an abstract at this point because they hadn't actually seen the on-the-ground potential impacts and the context for these problems. But we had some debate, and it wasn't really until we did that bus tour that things started to change. We started at, I think, 10 in the morning, and we went until 4 in the afternoon. And I had arranged for lunch at a restaurant catered for them. And by that time, the delegates were so engaged in discussion that no one was eating their meals. We actually had to get to-go bins for virtually everyone, and then it mostly went to waste because people kept talking. And then at the end of the day, when the bus driver needed to go home, he had to kick everyone off the bus because everyone was in discussion. I couldn't even talk over the tenor of the debate. And then we stood around in the parking lot for another hour or so discussing things. And for the next day, I was on the phone, kind of as an intermediary between the different delegates, trying to, and it didn't take a lot of work, actually, because we had another meeting a couple of days later, and we went through a scoring exercise. We had created our own set of criteria about how we could judge the value of these different projects. And we had something like 32 questions we asked for each of them. And we gave a point based on whether it was a yes or a no. And we created a matrix that ranked them all in terms of their scores, and then we ranked them in terms of their costs, and then we ranked them based on how they made us feel on that bus tour. And then we took all of our discussion into consideration. And that's how we arrived at our final $1 million consensus.
Well, that's great. To get that understanding from all the groups involved is great. Normally that's left up to us to figure out who gets what and that's in the pot. So thanks for explaining that. Appreciate that.
Councillor Davey?
Thank you. It's a great report, a great presentation. I appreciate it. Many of my concerns have been covered regarding the accountability and potential overlap with the neighborhood strategy. My concern, and I didn't really hear a clear answer, but my concern again is going back to the Hamilton example. And it says in the report, and I appreciate the full disclosure, that ultimately conflict between the residents and the councillor for Ward 2 in Hamilton over control of the process led to discontinuation of participatory budgeting. This is really sort of the last thing we want to see. So can you just give some idea of what the actual conflict was?
Sure. Through you, Mr. Mayor. So one of the initial concerns, and I mentioned this in my master's thesis, is that halfway through the process, I received an email from the councillor's office asking for all the personal information, not the personal information, the contact information of all the participants, so that it could be added to, quote unquote, the campaign database. I refused. I did not see participatory budgeting as a vehicle for re-election of the incumbent. I saw this as a civic engagement initiative. There were some back and forth emails clarifying that that was not what it was meant to mean. It wasn't meant campaign for the councillor, it was a campaign for the initiative itself. But that was where some trust started to fray between the volunteer organizers and the councillor's office. So I think it's very important that participatory budgeting not be perceived as being potentially a vehicle for the benefit of the incumbent. And I think that was one of the major conflicts in the process.
Okay, thank you. And my other concern with this, and it kind of represented a bit of a landmark shift in how I see budgeting. Because the way I see our budgeting process now is we sort of identify what the city needs to do, and then we try and figure out how we're going to fund it. Whereas this, and I'm really interested in improving accountability and trust, but this approach seems more like, let's collect tax dollars, whatever the funding source is, and then try and figure out how to spend it. Has there ever been any concern about that sentiment?
I'm going to go over to my colleague, Sean, who wants to jump in.
Sean? Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So I've had the opportunity to meet many of you through my work at Sustainable Waterloo as we were getting started in Climate Action Waterloo Region. I think that's a great example that when Climate Action Waterloo Region, we came and presented to you as council and to the other councils of the region. This was a negotiated agreement between the public, but also the organizations themselves. So Sustainable Waterloo and REAP were making an agreement on how these organizations would work together, share resources, share responsibility. They were also able to leverage, and I don't remember the exact ratio, but a few times more external dollars from FCM and from charities, foundations, to match the city and regional money that was put into it. So I think there's a big element of that piece as well. If you think of the city's LEAF Foundation, the Environmental Action Fund, of having environmental groups and environmental advocates deciding how pieces of a fund like that could be distributed. So you've already set the ground rules of here's what we will fund, here's what we won't fund. But imagine those organizations coming and sitting together at the table and looking for synergies and looking how to innovate together, working with city staff and working with council, but also each other. And I think having that final stamp of approval or that saying that we received money from the city of Kitchener, that allows, when I was with Sustainable Waterloo, that allowed us to go back to a foundation and to FCM and say, we have this, we're working together as a group. So I think from when we're looking at participatory budgeting, we should really see it as a driver of innovation and collaboration and a way for local organizations to work together. On the, sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. There's also the benefit from the success of the event itself. So if it is funding for a local music festival, I'm working on a folk music festival this summer. If I'm not able to get participants to vote for my idea, it's probably not a good idea, and they probably aren't going to buy tickets and come to the events after. So it's a really great way of pre-screening that as well, because that must be, a very tough part of your job, or for staff deciding which festivals get funding and which ones don't. So here's a way of actually being able to see from the folks who are going to show up to that festival, be the patrons, that they can be involved and engaged during that process.
Okay, thank you for that. And last question, Mr. Mayor, if I could. Just a question of process. I understand that this was on the priority list and it was 16 of 103. I'm just unclear in terms of how that gets put through, because what I'm seeing before us here are on page 1A-3, I'm seeing 4 questions as to how we want to proceed, and I'm concerned about, again, we haven't been asked the question whether we want to proceed. So if there is, and again, I'm not sure if that's the will of council or not, but my concern always is having staff go and embark on a bunch of work if ultimately council isn't interested in going this direction.
Well, I think I'll turn to Mr. Chapman, but I think the council's already prioritized this as a piece of work, as Mr. Chapman has indicated. And so we're now at a stage of looking at issues and providing input into what the ultimate report and recommendation will look like. Mr. Chapman? Well, I got to turn somebody off. Go ahead.
So through Mr. Mayor, I'll just reiterate my previous comments. So in 2015, Council engaged in a process to identify priority actions to include in the business plan. This was part of that process, and it was number 16 out of 103. And Council directed at that point that it be included in the business plan where it's resided for the past 2 years. So like every other project in that plan, we've already received direction to proceed with the project as it was defined back in 2015. We've proceeded based on that direction, entered into a relationship with the University of Waterloo, and we're here today to start to scope out that process with Council, understanding that you've already given direction to pursue it.
Mr. Mayor, may I add?
Yep.
The approach that's outlined here of a $20,000 allocation, up to a few, potentially 4, is what I would describe as a safe fail approach. There's an opportunity here to experiment with resources that could considerably improve the well-being of a variety of neighborhoods in the city at low cost, and we're not approaching it with the same sort of enthusiasm and grandeur of the $1 million allocation that was put on the table in Ward 2 for the very first time that we ever did it. So with the benefit of some experience, as well as a safe fail approach, I think there's an opportunity to experiment here with very little risk and potentially high reward. Of course, so that's ultimately a determination for council.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll come to you next. Yeah, Councillor Marsh, you haven't spoken yet, so go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I chose not to speak yet because I feel like we're not getting to where we need to get. But I just need to make a couple of comments based on some of my colleagues' comments. So first of all, thank you for this articulate and amazing presentation and for the opportunity that we have here with the University of Waterloo team. We don't have Sean Goby here today because, as we heard, he's with his young newborn, but I've worked with Sean Goby, and we're in great hands here. We are so lucky to have this team to collaborate with. I myself have done a little bit of research on participatory budgeting, not nearly as extensively as any of the people here from University of Waterloo, but I'm very excited that this opportunity is coming forward, and I want to assure Council that this is not unlike the $20,000 or $21,000 now grant that neighborhoods get through the Festival of Neighborhoods, where then they are given the opportunity to go through a process and decide how they're going to spend that money. It's very similar to that, only this way it's more it's much more facilitated in a very, very strong way with a lot of parameters around it and with a lot more input and assurances that there will be more people from whatever the assembly is defined as to decide on. This is going to be way more democratic, I'd say, than this is the ultimate in democracy right here. This is not something that we are going to be accused of, being foolhardy with. This is the opposite. And so I personally am extremely excited and And I think that with this full safe or fail safe method and full safe, I think that we will see that this in the fullness of time, that with 4 small budget pilot projects, that we are going to be having residents tripping over themselves, wanting us to do more pilots or to enter into a more long-term arrangement like this. So I'm excited to get forward to with the questions.
Okay. So, Councillors Ioannidis and Singh, do you have more questions, or Ioannidis? Okay, because I'm then going to move into input into the 4, because we're already over time, and I'm cognizant that we have some hard stops later on. So go ahead with your additional questions.
Okay, my one question is, I'm looking at the report here, and I see in Toronto we're awaiting results. So what's going on in Toronto? What is there, or is it coming up to in one of their current meetings to move ahead with this?
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not an expert on what Toronto is doing, and I'm not directly involved in what they're doing. I do know that Councillor, I believe Shelley Carroll, is the person spearheading participatory budgeting in Toronto, and they were working with a small amount of money in a similar, I think, pilot approach in, I believe, her ward.
Okay. Back to, this is more of a question to staff. When this came to the business plan, I'm wondering if we can recirculate those comments made by councillors on this in this specific topic, because I think I can confuse this as public engagement in the budget process more than what we are talking today. So, because if that's the case, then I think that may change mind of some of the members here and what if we move forward with this or not, because I know I definitely did not. When I looked at this, I thought it was residents participating in the budget. That's how I looked at it when I probably put it there. As
I think that was a separate item. In citizen engagement was a separate item, Councillor Ioannidis. So I'm not sure how you would have confused the two. But
citizens engagement, yes, that's what I thought it was. Participatory budgeting.
Right, but this is the point is that was a separate issue in the work plan. Citizen engagement. Councillor Singh.
Okay.
Well, I can attest to what Councillor Ioannidis is saying, because I thought something very similar. My colleague may not appreciate because it may have come from her as an idea, but what I'm saying is it seems a rapid process. This is not where I thought that where we would be as we entered our ideas. They would go through a process, staff would compile a report. At that point, we would have the basis of understanding what that idea is. When we engage in that process of prioritizing, we saw single item mentions. It didn't have the complexities of what that idea was and where it could take us. This is that process, and this is where an opportunity that we collectively should decide, okay, now that we have the information before us, this is what it means. Do we want to proceed with this or not? So I would like to challenge that process. I think we already running with this before of having had a fruitful conversation. Just so I can quickly, if we're not successful in kind of, I wouldn't say stopping this, because that's not the basis of my concern.
In fairness, that's not the process today. This is not a process to make decisions on this today.
I wasn't. So you stopped me mid-sentence in saying that very thing. Because this is an opportunity for us to provide input, so I want to make sure I include that. I still challenge it. I think we should perhaps consider this, and that we have to revisit that question, but so we can engage in the process of what we are here for today. My opinion to staff would be, I think we need to be cautious that if we proceed forward with this, it doesn't conflict with our neighborhood strategy. I would have hoped the response when I asked how much was looked at would have been a lot, and we're proceeding with this in support of the neighborhood strategy. If it's just in a reference, we've looked at it. I appreciate some staff members have been involved with it, but I think we've already vested significant amount of cost, staff time, and resource from our community through the neighborhood strategy that we don't want that to be conflicted with this. Especially because a lot of what you're saying here seems to be things that are popping up from the neighborhood strategy that we just went through very early. So that would be my first caution. The other would be perhaps delaying this until the neighborhood strategy matures to a point where we have better basis of understanding of how our communities are, the makeup of our neighborhoods
Councillor
are.
Singh, you're asking questions now? We're still in the question phase. You clicked in to ask additional questions? You had stepped out, and so you had clicked in prior to that to ask additional questions.
So you don't want me to give my
Well,
input?
we're getting there.
Oh, I see. I was giving my input. That's all. Because I already asked my questions.
Okay, then continue.
No, I had already asked my questions and I was giving my
Okay, well, you
input.
clicked in a second time, so I presumed it was for that purpose. Anyway, please, go ahead.
Okay. Again, the whole process has been a bit confusing, so my apologies if I misunderstood. So that would be my concern. Those would be my inputs, that it not conflict with the neighborhood strategy. And perhaps if we are proceeding with this, because any layers that can add for better citizen engagement is not a bad thing. It's a phenomenal thing. We just want to make sure that we do it in the right steps and time. So if this is something that could add to that, well, let's come to a conclusion or better understanding what the neighborhood strategy is, and then this be the next step of it. So it may not be something that we need to rush towards this, even if this is a positive direction that we're heading. Those would be my comments and my input.
Okay, Mr. May, you wanted to?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. I just don't. I don't want to leave council with the impression that this has not been considered. We have considered the connection between participatory budgeting and the neighborhood strategy a significant amount. The delegation's answer was because, as you know, the lead for this project from the University of Waterloo is off with his newborn child. So while this individual might not have been a part of those discussions, I can tell you that staff have had many discussions on this issue. So we've thought about it. We believe that there is no overlap. We believe there is great synergy. And that's why this is coming today, as the neighborhood strategy has now been completed.
Okay, I'm going to ask, okay, sorry, do you want to add something?
Just one thing, Mr. Mayor. The synergies are quite natural. We make plans, and then we need to execute them. And so the neighborhood strategy process develops plans, generates ideas, and the participatory budgeting process can determine in what order they should be implemented, and that's another way to engage residents. So there is, I don't think, any conflict between these two.
Okay, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions myself, and then if people want to actually provide input into the 4 questions that staff have asked, I'll be taking that input next. My question to you is, in terms of the other ones where you've researched and or had experience in, is the concern amongst around the initial implementation, does the concern lie amongst elected officials that perhaps somehow they're opening themselves up to citizens replacing them for what they think they were elected to do?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Do I still have to say through the chair?
Yeah, it's okay, don't worry about it.
Yes, I think that is a top-of-mind concern among municipal leaders, and I don't think it's the reality. I think that, if anything, this is a new opportunity for councillors to provide leadership as a facilitator of engagement, and I don't see these things as being conflictory at all.
Okay. You referenced some communities that had done some work on this, but that obviously wasn't an exhaustive list, because I believe Montreal has done some work on this as well as others. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Those are all the questions I have. I have certainly some thoughts on these 4, and I'll provide that at the end of going around to anybody else's input. Councillor Fernandez?
So just to be clear, would you all of them at the
input
same
on all
time?
4, yeah.
Okay.
And if we can keep it succinct.
Oh, I don't know if I can do that. No, I'm only kidding. So I think one of the most important outcomes when I'm looking at the list that we were given with ranking is certainly education of the government process, as well as improved accountability, because I think that's what you yourself said, one of the problems was trust. And once you started getting those people engaged, that trust heightened, and I think that's really important. About the population segment, I think it's really challenging because we have, as you identified in Ward 2 in Hamilton, you had a very diverse population. I think if you could find that diversity in a ward, then that might be a good way to approach a pilot. But if you're talking about 4 different pilots, then maybe 4 different wards might be a good opportunity then you're covering a real wide segment of the population. And so the next question was how many pilots will be undertaken. Was I to understand that it was 4 pilots that you were considering, or was there more or less? Sorry, that was the question.
Mr. Ryan?
Sure. So through the chair, we are talking about up to 4 pilots, and what we've talked about at our steering committee is essentially potentially doing 2 experiments in the youth category and 2 in the neighborhood category, and then we'd be able to test different things in each stream.
Okay, so then I would like to suggest instead of 2 in youth, no disrespect to our youth, but I think our seniors. I think you're looking at then 2 age spectrums, youth, seniors, and then hopefully you'll have a good mix of both in the other 2.
Okay, so not neighborhoods. Your preference would be 2 youth and 2.
No, sorry. 1 youth, 1 senior, and then 2 neighborhood.
Okay.
That would be my preference. Reasonable timelines for delivery. If you were to start in the summer, I would assume that we would hope to be completed in a 6-month time period. I think you said it took about 4 months the first time.
You can just leave your mic on, Ryan.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Mayor. It will depend on what the design is, but this process can be done in under a year, in as few as 6 months, definitely.
Okay. And the $20,000 that you're talking about, it would be per pilot, right? So that would be $80,000 total?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm going to make a real quick comment. I think this is really the next step and the perfect cross-pollination to our neighborhood strategy. So I really strongly hope that we can take the next steps to this. I want to see our citizens become engaged in making decisions around where their money gets spent, because that will help them understand the government process, because we get so many questions about that. So thank you for bringing this. I think you've done a great body of work here.
Okay, I have a few other people keyed in. I can also remind everyone to fill in this sheet and rank your options 1 to 5 and provide those to staff. Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Is that not what we're supposed? That's question number 1, right? So
we're doing all 4 questions
but is the
at once, and then you can provide this to staff.
Well, that's question number 1.
Mr. Mayor, may I clarify the ballot?
Sorry?
May I clarify this a little?
Sure.
So there's this is just for question 1.
Right.
That we're asking about here. There's 3 boxes where you could write in other priorities that we haven't listed that you think should be a priority. So rank from 1 to however many. And if you want to tie your ranks, that's fine. If you feel that things are both top priority, put them both as 1, and so on.
Okay, thank you. And then, as you're talking, you can provide any input for numbers 2, 3, and 4 as well.
Right. Okay. Well, I've already ranked it, so I just wanted to provide my ranking because I see that as question number 1. So for me, the most important piece would be to improve accountability and trust. I think this is a really good process for that. And then second would be to increase community engagement. And number 3 is increase effectiveness and engagement. And 4 is education. And number 5 is promotion of cooperation and social justice. And I put that down as 5 simply because I think we already do a really good job of the cooperation part of things. And so that's why it was a little further down on my list, not because it's not important. I just think we at the city already do a very good job of that. So I felt the other pieces were a little bit more important to focus on with regards to this. Number 2, with regards to the population segment, I had written down that some of the lowest voter turnout areas may be an opportunity to engage there to try and increase. I know there's been talk around increasing not only involvement in the participatory budget, but also try to, an outcome can be to increase the voter turnout as well. So I see that maybe being able to cross-pollinate there. And I agree with trying to hit youth in diverse communities. Number 3, I wrote down as many as feasible within the amount of money that we're allotting to this. So I know that there's 4 being suggested. But I would say, looking at the scope of things, if there was something that was going to get us a really big win, then 1 might be fine. So I kind of leave that, I think, to you guys. I'm fine with kind of 1 through 4. And number 4, with regards to the timelines, I had written down 6 months to a year, depending on the size and the scope of the project, as well as the value of the money. I think right now we're dealing with smaller numbers with regards to money, and so it might not need as long to vet, but if we ever get to a process where, we are doing something like a Hamilton with $1 million, I wouldn't want to see, even though they did in a short time frame, I would like to see us make sure we vet the process. So I kind of say that 6 months to a year, depending on where this goes and focus. And I quickly just wanted to make one quick comment that we are already doing a lot of this. We're just formalizing it to some degree. There's a lot of engagement in our community that we get feedback that gets filtered into our budget process already. This is just a different mechanism for us to be able to establish more input from the community and have some of their wants and needs. Again, it's already been said, it's going to dovetail very nicely with the neighborhood strategy, and I'm all for that. So I appreciate the process, how it's come forward and how it's moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Etherington.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's a mix of comments and answers to these questions. My number 1 outcome involves the increased public participation and community engagement. I don't think you can put a price on that type of involvement, and that's why we're boosting our support for our neighborhood projects. I would emphasize that I have no problem if there's a synergy, any kind of synergy with those neighborhood programs, because the more we support and encourage community involvement, the healthier, in my opinion, the healthier our city will be. I support the choice of neighborhoods and youth. I would add to that if we move ahead with neighborhoods, for example, we should be aware that I've seen a trend developing of smaller groups within our established neighborhood groups that often, particularly in my ward, are very active on these type of issues. So I think it's an excellent proposal and agree we should move ahead as soon as possible this summer.
Councillor Marsh.
Thank you. I will save my ranking sheet. I don't need to repeat what I put down, but I will say that I think all 5 of the options are important. So it is hard to say that one is, so much more important than 5. For number 2, I really liked the suggestions of neighborhoods as well as youth. Neighborhoods, of course, it makes sense. With youth, I've often found that, when we have our youth forum, we have all these terrific ideas that come in twice a year from groups of youth who come forward in a Dragon's Den style, process where they have to convince us to implement a new idea. And then those are projects that get marked by their teachers, and and they're great ideas that get tabulated by staff. But I don't know to what degree we seriously look at implementing those ideas. I think that this would be an opportunity for us to consider, the best projects of each round would be entered into the process for youth to vote on. That's just one idea that came to mind when I was reading this. I also I don't mind if we have less than 4 pilot projects if it means that a lot of the ideas would be bigger budget items. But if we need to experiment and compare with testing out different methods, then 4 does sound like a reasonable amount, so it doesn't matter to me. And anywhere up to a year in terms of reasonable timeline, from 4 months to a year makes sense to me. I also want to just point out that in the last Environics study that we did, that Compass Kitchener oversaw, accountability was ranked as the most important aspect that citizens wanted to see. And so that's why we have open government as our first priority within our strategic plan. And right here it says our open government, we will be transparent and accountable to citizens, providing easy access to information, a great customer service experience, and meaningful opportunities to participate in the democratic process, which I think this is a great way to do that.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Urbanovic. I think if we're going to make opinions here, I think item number 1, I think the outcome that I would like to see is this tied to the neighborhood strategy and with that funding model, because to me, I don't see any difference in those two. I think these are exactly the same, in my opinion. But number 2, what population segment should be targeted? I wholeheartedly, I think we're going to be going through the process of age-friendly communities. I think we should be targeting more seniors more. In particular, I think a good avenue is looking at snow removal for seniors. So that's something I think we should be looking at. How many pilots will be undertaken? I think it should be in every single ward, 10. What reasonable timelines? Well, I think we should start when the consultant said to start.
Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, like input on the 4.
I can't believe how fast my fingers are working. I just pushed it and I'm on the floor.
Sometimes it works that way.
Oh, well, I'm sorry I wasn't here for the entire presentation. Something came up that didn't allow me to be here. I did read up about it on the weekend. I did go in to the internet to try to find out about participatory budgeting. There's a lot of information about it. I must say it's not at all what I thought it was. I know when we were sitting here looking at a business plan and looking at priorities, participatory budgeting was raised, and who can not support that? It sounds like it's giving the entire community an opportunity to get involved with our budgeting process. And of course, it's number 16 or whatever that it is. So, but it's not what I envisioned. I won't talk about the operating budget, that's a year-to-year thing, but it's a capital. We have a huge capital forecast, which is supposedly prioritized now by council. I think it is. My concept of participatory budgeting was that we would have a group of interested and independent citizens going over that capital forecast and coming up with what they felt their priorities were. I don't know if anybody asked this question, and I apologize if they did. So, to me, that would have been participatory budgeting, and then when you get an independent group of people looking at something and coming up with their ideas, maybe they would come up with the idea that yes, the direction council's moving in is great. So that's what I thought, and this isn't what I'm seeing here. I quite frankly look upon this as another make-work project, and will require a lot of time, and to what end, I'm not sure. But I will answer the 4 questions. When it comes to the all of those items on there are very important. Increasing public engagement, education, accountability, and trust are all important. And I don't know that one is more important than the other. So I think those have to be top of mind when we're dealing with everything. If I have to pick something, I would look at increased effectiveness of budget allocations. To me, that would be all those other things. I think they're being looked after. But if there's a better way of doing things that will cost our residents, our taxpayers, less, and give them the same service, that's really important. So I picked that as what I would like to see. The others are all important, and I hope to see them every day in everything we do, so I'm not going to rank them. Now, when it comes to the rest of the question, I'm going to jump to number 3, because how many pilots should be undertaken? To my way of thinking, there should be 10 pilots, 1 for each ward. I don't want to. What we're doing is we're throwing a $20,000, $25,000 gift to each out there and say, what do you want to do with it? Well, we're going to do that. Let's do it with each ward, and then to what segment should it be? It should be targeted at everyone in that ward. So leave it up to the entire ward if that's they want to, and I think out of that will rise a situation. I'm sure if there's we're going to throw a gift out to every ward saying, hey, you've got $25,000 to spend. I'm sure we'll get a lot of takers, and I'm sure there are a lot of wonderful ideas out there. And so, as far as timeliness of this, it's not an urgent, pressing matter as far as I'm concerned. So, I don't have any great timelines. If this, I'm not totally convinced of the whole process. A number of councillors, even as late as I was being here, but a number of councillors are questioning whether we really want to go do we want to go ahead with this sort of thing? I think that's a legitimate question. There's been a fair amount of work put in by staff and by outside helpers, and yes, they've done an excellent job. They've brought a good report back to us, but now's a good time to take a pause and say, do we want to continue on with this, or do we want to? We have a lot of balls in the air right now, a lot of balls in the air, and one of the ones that you've all mentioned is the neighborhood strategy. So this just throws another ball up there to hit all the other balls that are up there. So that's my opinion and my choices. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Gazzola. Councillor Davey.
Thank you. I share some concerns. I do think that even if there is synergies between the neighborhood strategy and this, that I think what they're looking to achieve are very similar. So I too, to be clear, I have concerns with this, and I'd rather see a bigger bang out of the neighborhood strategy than I see this as a potential bit of dilution of engagement. But be that as it may, my job is to provide input, so I will. In terms of the ranked sheet, I think I really only filled out one. That's improved accountability and trust, because there still is a big disconnect between what we do in the decision-making process and what the average resident thinks goes into the decision-making process. And I think anything we can do to clarify that would be very useful. In terms of the population segment, I think that in order to minimize the amount of extra work that needs to be done, I think there's 2 groups we should really look at. And I do think that is, frankly, the youth, the non-voters in our community that are sometimes overlooked. We have a great committee, Kayak, I think, that could do much of this work, if not all of it, in terms of making a decision. And as well, I think the seniors group, Max, which we have in the Mayor's Advisory Council, I think that would be an appropriate group as well to give them some an actual budget and some work to do if we're going to go through with this process. So to answer the third question then, how many pilots we undertaken? I think 2. In terms of reasonable timelines, that's something I'm not terribly concerned about.
Okay, Councillor Singh, you have something additional to add?
Yeah, my apologies. I didn't follow the process, and you tried cautioning me that time, so I want to make sure that I answer the questions as they were laid out. For number 1, I share the earlier comments that approved accountability and trust seems to be the foremost importance in our community, but also for education of government process. So I'm going to mention 2. And as for the population segment, I again want to reiterate, I think the youth should be the focal point as we want to increase engagement and their participation with local government as they're maturing, as well as I think new members to our community, new citizens that have decided to make our city as their home. Try to bring them early on into the fold, and somehow some pilot project could be catered towards that as a second group. That would be great. Number of pilot projects, 4 seems to be on the low end. I think it would have been better if there were a few more, so we could engage on multiple different levels as well and more wider area within our community. But I think 4 seems to be the safe number. And as a reasonable timeline, I did say this, but I'll say it again. My concern on the onset of this was I did not want this to conflict with a neighborhood strategy. And I could only, counter to what I heard, and that's caused my concern further. But again, it was further clarified by Mr. May. So if there are synergies with the neighborhood strategy, that's great. Again, but I still like to think that the neighborhood strategy needs to be the anchor, and this needs to be the complement. And that's where we need to have the more focus on, and then this come at a later point. And thank you, Mr. Mayor, for trying to help clarify. Again, my apologies for the misunderstanding.
Okay, thank you. Any additional comments? Not, I'll make. Go ahead, Councillor Gazzola.
I'm sorry, and it's something that I've wanted to say, and I missed saying it. Just if I can take 2 minutes, I've often tried to think out of the box, and then I've always had a concept of doing something in our community that would allow what I feel is participatory budgeting or participatory action, and that is allowing our community centers to operate on their own without the direct operation of the city. I would like to see the community center be provided with a certain number of dollars from the city, and then leave it up to that community to operate their own community center as they best see within a certain set of rules. To me, that would really allow a group, that our own citizens, to really do something and have complete control and decisions with a board of directors in a community center. And if they don't live within certain rules and regulations that are common sense, they're thrown out. That, to me, would give people an opportunity to really get involved with government. I want to just throw that out as a pilot project. I would throw out as a pilot project, do that for one community center.
Okay, Councillor Gazzola, in fairness, you're going into a very different direction than what participatory budgeting it is. I think you've raised something that certainly there can be discussion about. I would suggest that you have an offline discussion with Mr. May about it, and if it's something that you want to bring forward as a motion in the future, the next time we look at the work plan, then that's something that Council can deal with at that time. In the meantime, this is a very different issue. I don't see anybody else in the queue right now, so I will offer first of all, my thanks to the group that's done all of the background work on this. Participatory budgeting is a very innovative way that we're seeing take place in municipalities not only in Canada, but abroad as well, to really find ways of better engaging citizens in the municipal process, particularly in the municipal capital process for areas of the city or in terms of different groupings. I think it is, as staff have indicated, something that actually does work in synergy with the work of the neighborhood strategy, which we'll be considering and ratifying later this evening. In terms of the specific questions that have been asked of us, in terms of number one, I believe that improved accountability and trust, coupled with increased community engagement, truly is the most important part of the criteria that have been identified. In my view, ultimately, anything that gives our residents a more direct say in how their tax dollars are being spent is something that I am always inclined to support. And it's the kind of messaging, quite frankly, that I've heard from all members around this horseshoe at different points in time, using various language. I think starting this in a measured, disciplined way, so that we can work out any issues and kinks, not with $200,000 or $1 million allotments, but with $20,000 allotments, is, for those who are concerned about accountability, the way to go. And so I think we need to keep it very, very focused and measured. I think when it comes to the number of pilots, in my view, this isn't about one ward versus the other, particularly when we're talking about pilots. I think to suggest that 10 is a reasonable number of pilots is probably somewhat overwhelming for staff and our partners in terms of seeing it achieved in any sort of reasonable way. Is 4 the right number? I'm not sure. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 5, but something in that range seems reasonable to me. I like the idea of a couple of neighborhoods in the city, maybe one that's sort of a singular kind of mix in the neighborhood, and another one that actually has a varied mix of people in terms of socioeconomics, diversity, and so on, maybe a way of approaching it. I certainly am supportive of the youth. The youth, as we know, are a group that all orders of government are trying to connect with and reach out to, and I would be supportive of that. I would be also supportive of looking at the seniors pilot as an option. I think part of the reality is seniors generally aren't shy of becoming engaged and becoming involved, and so we do tend to see higher levels of engagement from them in voting and other things. But there may be some merit in looking at that, and I'd like to see staff take a look at that. As I said, in terms of numbers of pilots, 4 might be right, 3, 5, but I think to start approaching large numbers like 1 per ward initially is probably biting off more than we can chew. And is it something that I think we ultimately need to work towards? Absolutely. But that's once we get beyond the pilot stage, assuming things are working in a favorable manner. Finally, in terms of timelines, 6 months to a year seems reasonable to me, particularly because we're talking about small, focused pilots as opposed to large-scale ones, and so it becomes more manageable to deal with it. Again, I think we all know, and we've all articulated at various points in time, that we want to see better civic engagement from our residents. We want to see people get more involved. We want to improve accountability and trust. We heard that that's a priority, as has been identified. through the work that we've done through Compass Kitchener. And I want to end my comments by actually focusing on that, because I think this city has a history of being innovative in its approaches towards citizen engagement and being at the forefront in terms of some of the things that we're looking at. We have taken some steps along this path over the course of this past year, over the past number of years, as a number of you have touched on and spoken about, and this starts really to put all of it together. And I would hope, and the purpose of why we have these sessions is for council to have input before a report ultimately comes back, but that'll also be an opportunity for the public to come forward and identify their interest and support or lack thereof as part of an ultimate report that comes back to council. And that's why, as we know, with everything, any major initiative, there is a strategic planning session, and then there's ultimately the public report and citizen engagement that happens as part of that. So with that, thank you to all of you for the work that's been done, and I really look forward to what's going to come forward, and I'm hopeful we will continue to be a leader in this regard, particularly when I think about that the Compass Kitchener and the fact that we're one of the only councils where we actually have a citizens committee, where we actually took the chance to have a citizens committee that every 2 years grades council in terms of how we're doing or not doing in certain aspects. It's not a lot of councils that do that. And in the years that we've actually had that happen, I don't think the process has gone awry at any point. I think they've always been reasonable and fair in terms of what they've brought back to us. And I think in time, as these pilots hopefully move forward, we will see the same kind of thing happen from citizens engaged in this type of process going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Fernandez, quick question.
Yeah.
Click in.
Sorry. If we filled out these, does Norm want them, or do staff want them?
Yes.
Or?
Ryan
Okay.
will collect them.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on then to the next item, and we're going to have to stay focused, folks, as we move forward. There's a presentation, and then we're going to have to provide input in terms of the development incentives for affordable housing, keeping in mind that we have a 5:30 start with respect to an appreciation event downstairs for our volunteers with the neighborhood strategy, and we're likely going to need to the in-camera items. We're probably, unless we have the time, we're probably going to have to leave them until after at the end of council. So with that, staff 3. Brandon.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Staff will have a brief presentation, about 9 slides, and then we can get right into your input on the discussion questions. And maybe through Mr. Mayor, we'll leave it up to you if you want to have the 3 discussion topics open and members of council could comment on any of them all at once in order to speed up the time. Shelter is a basic human need. Unfortunately, it's getting harder and harder for members of our community to afford it. Although the region is the service provider for housing within our area, and they have established programs to allocate funding for affordable housing, there are still some things that the local level municipality can do to make providing affordable housing a little bit easier. The purpose of the strategy session today is to provide a bit more information on certain development incentives that are in progress or could be put in place, and also to get your input and direction on helping with implementation. Of note, that the scope of the work and the discussion that we're having today is really focused on incentives, or the carrots as they're referred to, and not necessarily about the regulatory sticks, such as requiring a development to provide a certain number of floors of affordable housing. The province will be providing additional regulations as it relates to inclusionary zoning, and that would be a topic for a different day. Very quickly on how we got here, there was a November 2015 Phase 1 report that outlined the roles of different levels of government and affordable housing providers, provided examples of programs that other municipalities use. Usually you see these in a single tier or upper tier municipality. And there was also pros and cons provided for 7 potential development incentives. The direction was to further investigate 4 of those. And there's also some new information that's arisen about another possible option. Since that time, Lauren's done an incredible amount of work with many different internal business units, along with the region, City of Waterloo, and Cambridge, and she'll take you through each one of these items.
Thank you. Of the 5 different development incentives that were looked at throughout this report, 2 of them can in fact be implemented through existing corporate projects. Those 3 being property tax increment grants, planning application and building permit fees, and the timing of the payment of development charges. Additional criteria for eligibility and scope were actually considered for those 3 that would require new policies or programs. The first being the definition of affordable. We understand the provincial definition sets the rental threshold at a fairly high monthly amount, and it can be even as high as $12.50 per month in rent. Staff are recommending that municipal incentives should set a more robust threshold or standard, especially as incentives would be above and beyond the typical role of a lower tier municipality. Recommended eligibility criteria would therefore be that incentives would be made available to not-for-profit or charitable organizations that are building affordable rental housing, and that the rate should actually be lower than market rate, such as 15% below. The next criteria would be the time frame for incentives. So for any of the 3 incentives that we were looking at under this category, the idea would be to have a 5-year program that's implemented, and at that point review to confirm the long-term approach. Lastly, we also have the criteria for geographic scope of these different incentives, where it's very important to strive and ensure that we have a balance of housing affordability throughout the city and preferably throughout the region. Options for different geographies for different incentives could include areas that are within walking distance to LRT or major transit routes like the iExpress routes, or alternatively, incentives could be applied citywide. We will have discussion questions specific to the geographic scope for each of the 3 incentives. So now we'll go through each of the 5 sequentially, and starting with reduced parking requirements. Some of the benefits of reduced parking rates are that it can increase the feasibility of building affordable units and increase the unit yield on a site. It's particularly effective where units are built in areas that have access to other transportation modes, such as walking, cycling, or transit. Through the comprehensive review of the zoning bylaw, staff have introduced a first draft of parking regulations, which was tabled publicly in June of 2016. That first draft featured a number of pretty significant parking rates that are lower than the current rules, especially in areas that are close to transit. And these rates introduced benefit all types of development, including affordable housing. I'll note that defining and administering affordable housing as its own use in a zoning bylaw can be problematic because we cannot deal with tenure through zoning. So it's more appropriate to actually consider these in terms of site context and available transportation options. The staff recommendation for this incentive would be to continue to implement this initiative through the comprehensive review of the zoning bylaw and deliver that to a statutory public meeting in the spring of 2018. The next incentive is density bonusing. Density bonusing allows for buildings to exceed the maximum height and/or density zoning requirements in exchange for community benefits. Density bonusing for affordable housing can have the positive effect of increasing the supply of affordable units that are built in eligible areas of the city. Again, through the comprehensive review of the zoning bylaw, a bonusing framework was tabled publicly in June 2016. It featured different bonus values that are relative based on each of the community benefits, and the highest priority was given to residential units and affordable housing. In addition to that, the secondary plan review process It will also be implementing new density bonusing frameworks in and around the LRT station areas, and that was also a recommendation of the council-approved parts central plan. So again, the implementation of this item would be to continue to implement through Crosby and the station area review processes, and that would be delivered to a statutory public meeting in the spring of 2018. On to our next incentive. Tax increment grants are incentives that are provided to a landowner that are equal to either the full amount or a partial amount of the increase in taxes after a property has been redeveloped. It can offer a small benefit to housing providers and is generally positive for the city because it encourages investment, economic activity, and it provides the much-needed housing. A current example of this is the Brownfield Tax Increment Grant Program. Some preliminary financial analysis was conducted as part of the report based on recent affordable housing developments, and it finds that for past examples of sites, the average increase in the annual taxes pre to post development is around $7,000 for these types of sites. We can also project that to looking at a number of different types of programs in terms of the length of time that they apply, and you'll see examples on the screen in terms of the financial impact there. Implementation of this type of incentive would occur through a community improvement plan process, which is a statutory public process under the Planning Act. It also requires considerable staff resources to implement and to administer. I'll also note that the region portion of taxes is much higher than the city portion. Staff have had some conversations with the Region of Waterloo staff, and they are looking at a potential tax increment grant and other incentives this year and expect to bring a report to Regional Council later in 2017. A joint program with the region that covers both jurisdictions' taxes would be of more benefit to the affordable housing provider. A discussion question is included on this topic that we'll get to after the presentation. Our next incentive is the planning application and building permit fees. We understand that development proposals trigger various types of municipal fees. Two of the types of fees that are often considered in a municipal incentive program like this are building permit fees and planning application fees, so that includes things like zone changes or site plans. Exempting not-for-profit and charitable organizations from the payment of these fees does provide some upfront relief as affordable housing providers are often challenged with the timing of their funding. Again, some financial analysis was conducted based on some recent affordable housing sites in Kitchener, finding that the average annual cost of planning application fees would be about $5,000, and the annual average cost of building permit fees is around $17,000. A council policy could specifically exempt the payment of planning application and building permit fees for not-for-profit and charitable housing providers. Again, a discussion question will be included for this topic. Lastly, we have the timing of the development charge payment. Development charges pay for the necessary infrastructure to support growth. The city has received a site-specific request from an affordable housing provider to pay development charges prior to the occupancy permit stage rather than building permit stage. Over the last 10 to 15 years, there's only a finite number of examples where a development charge payment has occurred at a different milestone, and all of these were for affordable housing projects and typically for not-for-profit affordable housing providers. Planning staff believe that the establishment of a proactive, consistent, and predictable arrangement would be of meaningful benefit because it's also known to help affordable housing providers bridge their financing. Similarly to property taxes, the regional portion of development charges is much higher, and so therefore it could be more meaningful to actually combine for a joint program. To give you an example, a 60-unit residential building could require up to $200,000 or $700,000 in city and regional portions if it's in the central neighborhoods, and higher if it's in suburban locations. There are some risks that would have to be managed for an incentive such as this one, such as legal agreements and mechanisms for the collection of development charge payments. Implementation of a formal program would require planning, building, finance, and legal staff to follow up with the preparation of a council policy. So this concludes the staff presentation. There are 3 slides remaining. Each have specific discussion questions. At this point, I would turn it back to the chair to help facilitate some of that discussion.
We have 7 of you who have keyed in. Is this to provide input to the 3 or to ask questions about what's been presented thus far? Questions? Okay, so let's do questions. Keep in mind that actually we're going to have to end this part by probably 10 after 5 because the one caucus item we need to deal with before council this evening. So we may have to come back for some additional time on this. If you can click out if it's not questions right now, and then you can click back in for feedback. Councillor Singh.
I'll try to be brief as possible, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mayor, so you mentioned bonusing as an incentive for affordable housing. My understanding is from the report that the impetus would be for affordable housing units to be dispersed amongst our future development. Is that correct?
Through the chair, the proposed new zoning approach includes a few different ways that bonusing could help achieve affordable housing units. One, it could be if the actual development proponent of that site provides it on that site, then there could be additional floor space. The other option that we've proposed is that in lieu of providing it on the site, there could be a contribution towards something else, which is either towards the regional program where they allocate affordable housing units, or another option might be even if the city establishes a fund.
But to accomplish that, are we going to be fair, though, that we're not proposing a direction where we're going to purposefully reduce the densities so that the developers are required to I guess, participate and through either having the units at that development or a benefit back to the community through contribution? Is it consistent to what our rules and regulations are for zoning and densities, and then if they just wanted additional density on top of what is allowed currently?
Through the mayor, I'd suggest that those densities were established through the new official plan that council's already adopted, and so the bonusing through the zoning is above that amount.
Okay, all right, good. And is there effort to also maximize working with the region? So if there's incentives through, lessening of our fees or DCs, that it's further leveraged with the region as well?
Through the mayor, that's our suggestion on at least 2 of the discussion topics today, about the tax increment grant program and about the development charges timing of payment.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you. Just a quick question that I noticed that we work with the City of Waterloo. In general terms, is there more affordable housing currently, like on a per capita basis in Kitchener than Waterloo?
Through the chair, on a per capita basis, yes, that is correct. We did actually look and do a survey in the first phase of this report that came forward in November of 2015. That report highlighted sort of the difference, and it shows that Kitchener and Cambridge do provide a fair number of affordable housing on a per capita basis, and in Waterloo it is a little bit lower.
Okay, and when the province is calculating these rates, do they calculate the rates including the property value differences between Kitchener, Cambridge, and Waterloo?
Through the chair, the regional rates that are established in terms of the rent threshold are region-wide, so they would be the same in any 3 of those jurisdictions.
Okay, so there wouldn't be a different classification for affordable housing levels in Waterloo as there would be in Kitchener?
Not based on the provincial definition.
That's good. Do we know if the City of Waterloo is looking at any of the items that we're looking at here, implementing in terms of the DCs, the TIG, building permits, et cetera?
So we have had conversations with staff at the Region of Waterloo, the City of Cambridge, and the City of Waterloo. Generally speaking, they're all positive conversations where folks are interested in working on some joint initiatives. Cambridge and Kitchener are sort of further along, I think, in those topics in terms of trying to come forward with the development incentives that are there now. Waterloo is interested at least in being part of the conversation.
Okay, so my concern is if we're already ahead and we're looking at providing more incentives, what does it look like over a 20, 30, 50-year time frame if all of the incentives are in the city of Kitchener and there's none in the city of Waterloo? So I guess my question is there any way that we can apply pressure if they're not following through on this, making some of these issues contingent, for example, the tax incremental grants, et cetera? Is there any way that we could look at making these contingent on City of Waterloo adopting similar policies?
Through the mayor, I think we would suggest that it's open to members of council as to how you answer those questions and provide those directions or any motions that may come from that.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Gazzola.
I want to go over the 5 different areas we're looking at. On the first 2, the parking and the bonusing, who benefits from that? Is that the developer or is that the ultimate tenant or homeowner?
Through the chair, through Mr. Mayor, I would suggest there are many individuals and groups that benefit. Number one, it's probably overall in the public interest to provide additional incentives for affordable housing that benefits everybody. The landowner developer would benefit from those first 2, especially the parking one, as it reduces the cost associated with the development, and therefore you could allocate that towards the actual creation of the dwelling unit or more dwelling units for affordable housing.
Okay, that's, but I'm not clear on that. I see the benefit going more to the developer than to the ultimate owners. So, because like for example, if we take, I want to move on to the next one, that TIG. I'm not sure how exactly that would work, but the way it works with the brownstones, it really does help the developer, does it not, in the first instance?
Through Mr. Mayor, on the first 2, in theory, the end user or those that may be renting the units may be able to rent it at slightly less because they don't have to pay for that additional parking, $100 a month or whatever it might have been to construct or lease the parking space. Related to the actual tax increment grant piece, there's, I think we point out in the report, it may be questionable of the benefit. When you look at the pre to post development amounts, it's not a considerable jump in this regard. And so annually, it's not a huge amount of money that we're talking about compared to the brownfield TIG. You see a greater incremental difference, and so there is a benefit, more of a benefit to that one. I think we point out in the report that it's somewhat questionable, especially given the administrative cost that it would take to keep that program going.
In the example you give on 1B8, how many units would be involved with those? There were 5 sites that you've looked at over a 5-year period. I was just curious as to how many units we would be looking at.
Through the mayor, if you flip to the previous page, 1B7, there's a chart that actually shows the number of sites and the number of units.
Okay.
So it's ranging, in some examples it's as low as 6 units, and in others it's about 56 units, so that's sort of the range.
All right, so and you threw out the 2016, I think, of the 2009, right? In your, so we're, okay, so the answer is we're looking at about 120 units. That's fine. The incentive for building permits, can that be funded out of our huge surplus in our building permits reserves?
Through Mr. Mayor, our friend from Finance is here to assist with some of the questions.
Hurry though, I'm losing my time here.
No, sorry, Brian. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
No. In a word, no.
Why not? If the building permit fee is lower, wouldn't that come through there? I'll leave that. I'm not clear on that, and to me it should be able to be partially funded out of there. My last question is on the development charges. Does that really cost us any money? It's really just a matter of lost interest for us, is it not?
Correct. It's just a timing difference. So we would still get all our money, but it might be 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever the policy states.
Yeah, so to implement that would be a minimal or very little, if any, cost to the city.
Right. The cost would be minimal. There are some other nuances with it for council to consider.
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Thank you, Mayor Urbanovic. First of all, I just want to commend staff on it. This is a fabulous report, by the way. I think there's a lot of good things in here that could really help affordable housing. One question I have is regards to when we're dealing with the bottom three items, and it's implementing those incentives for property taxes and application fees and permit fees and development charges. Why are we only looking at just the housing provider that's a non-for-profit?
So through the chair, for those incentives, the main impact of using kind of a scoped definition versus a broader definition would basically be an increase in the number of developments that could apply. When we look at the provincial definition that sets the rental threshold at around $12.50 per month, we think that the truly affordable rate is actually set below that amount. And so by using not-for-profit or charitable organizations as the criteria or threshold for that, it increases the ability that we'll have lower rental rates, rental units, and also that they can be secured over a period of time as well, since we can't really get at the rental or the tenure piece through typical mechanisms. Another effect is that providing these incentives to all types of development incentives would require a CIP process, so that's a community improvement plan process under the Planning Act. And that's kind of based on legislative authority in the Municipal Act and the Planning Act. Based on examples from other cities, that's typically an 8 or 9 month process at a minimum, because it is a statutory public process and requires consultation with the province as well.
Okay. Thank you for that, but would it make more sense, because when you're looking at non-for-profit, there's really a very small amount of organizations out there that do this. For example, KHI, Kitchener Housing, which is one of the boards I sit on, and they'll be very appreciative of this stuff as well. But the goal is to create more affordable housing. So wouldn't it be better to open it up to everybody? Because to me, that makes more sense than just the nonprofits.
Through the mayor, I would suggest that that is something that council could discuss and debate. I think we've put forward what the staff recommendation is that we've heard from some of the not-for-profit providers that they're really struggling, and even some of these incentives would assist. It's up to council to discuss and debate if you have an interest in opening it up to for-profit private developers.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. May, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps I could just share, just reiterate something that I think was compelling for me on this issue. If you don't change the definition to what staff have suggested, what we could have is people who are building units at $1,200 a month for rent applying for municipal affording housing incentives. And I think staff's perspective is $1,200 is not the true type of affordable housing that council has been interested in. So that's just, to me, one of the big deciding factors as to why we wanted to scope the definition.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, can we not lower the definition of affordable housing instead?
Through Mr. Mayor, that's what staff are recommending, that it be at about 15% below that amount.
Okay.
Councillor Etherington.
I completely agree with this, the findings in this report. It's an excellent report, but if, as it says, the provision of affordable housing is a priority in Kitchener, and this is one of Council's top 6 priorities, why are we looking at a delay of 1 or 2 years, another 1 or 2 years? It's what I've been told, before pushing ahead with some action on this subject. We've already waited 16 months since the last report in November of 2015. At the same time, we've got an increasing list. I think it's still at about 3,000 names, maybe more. That could be about 10,000 adults and children waiting years. I understand waiting longer terms for low-cost shelter in Waterloo region. So my basic overall question is, what's taking so long?
Through the mayor, yes, these are priority items. To walk through each of the three topics we have for the discussion questions today, starting with the tax increment grant program, this is something that we'd like to hear council's input to as to whether or not there is value in going ahead of the region. And if so, then staff would immediately work on that and bring that to council. On the planning application fees and building permit fees, the context for that is that if the direction from council from the discussion today is to move forward with something like this, as mentioned by Lauren, a council policy is what would be needed, and that could be done within the next few months, right away. The same thing for the third item, the timing of development charge payment, also a council policy if it's in accordance with the way that staff is recommending it in the report. That could also be done within the next few months.
I appreciate that, Brandon, but do you agree it could be 2 years before we're into this?
Through the mayor, it may depend on City Council's desire to leverage and get more out of any incentives by working with the region and moving the region along in their consideration of this topic and or any of the other municipalities out there.
And I agree on that as well. My next question would be, during that period of time, we're already seeing seniors, low-income people being squeezed out of their current accommodation. They'll add to that waiting list because of particularly along the LRT route. So I just think we should be ready to move on that. Will we be ready to move if, as we saw recently, the federal government, again, I don't know whether they'll do it or not, but if the billions of dollars come down the pipe that are promised, are we going to be ready with some of these programs?
Through Mr. Mayor, we could be ready. We're not aware of any of the programs through which the region allocates happening in the immediate future, but we could get several of these in place very quickly.
I hope so. My one other question relates to what we've just discussed. I also sit on the board of Kitchener Housing. If private developers were involved in this, as well as charitable groups, groups like Kitchener Housing could go in and manage those units and presumably control rental prices. Have we looked at that? Kitchener Housing does a lot of management.
Through Mr. Mayor, that may be something that could be explored in terms of how the partnerships work, but it would add another bit of complexity to the work and a little bit outside of the scope of where we were going. And we were hoping to get something in place a little bit sooner to at least help those that are looking at it sooner. It is something that, as Lauren mentioned, when looking at this program, we could continue to refine it over time.
So you want to move sooner? I'm sorry. That's my question. Thanks.
Councillor Netsky?
Yeah, thank you for a very good report. I do like a lot of the incentives that you got coming forward on this. However, I do have a handful of questions here that I wish to present. When you're talking about an exemption of the planning fees and building permits, straightforward, that just means less revenue for the city in the end. Is that correct?
Through Mr. Mayor, generally, yes. There are some concerns with this because it has an impact on operating budgets. And so we would need to look for some kind of funding mechanism.
Okay. And if that's the case, the complement of staff that you have right now would still continue on? You don't need to extra staff? Will you get more applications?
Through Mr. Mayor, based on how staff are recommending that it would apply to not-for-profit, we estimate that we would not need any additional staff for that.
Okay, I figured so. The fees for the application process and the building fees, the applications are initiated by a charity group or by the building industry to build a particular project?
Through Mr. Mayor, typically what we see is that when the region has funding to allocate in a given year, and they are looking for providers or those that are developing and managing affordable housing to apply, those are usually the time frames or the peaks when we would get pre-submission meetings or there'd be applications. So usually it would be a not-for-profit provider that would ultimately submit an application. Typically what happens is the region's program, if they are awarded it, funds a certain percentage of the application fees. So it would get paid through the regional program. So I guess there's a few sides to that consideration or discussion. Is that really much of a value to do that? Or in some cases, even if it's that a certain amount or a certain percentage, that percentage or amount could go towards providing at least one more affordable housing unit. So every little bit might help.
Okay, appreciate that. So really, in the end, it's the money that the province gives to the region that calls the shot in the end.
Through the mayor, generally, yes.
Okay. The question you had on the back in terms of the development charge payment prior to occupancy, would that be prior to occupancy of the first occupancy unit or the last occupancy unit, or all in between spread out?
Through Mr. Mayor, we could further decide on that through the process of implementing, putting forward that type of a policy. We need to look at how we manage some of the risk of that. And so, we may do it before the first occupancy permit, but there may be options to look at that it could be spread out.
Because I saw that a risky process to do. It's just an issuance. Once the units are occupiable, then that's the trigger, I would think, right?
Through Mr. Mayor, I'd suggest that's part of the discussion that Council could have on that question today.
Okay.
Or through that process as well.
And my last question is, of the developments that you've had here, the 7, these are all individual groups that have applied or builders that have done it, and it's not where you get mixed housing, where you get maybe a project of let's say 50 units, of which 25 are affordable and 25 would be just at market rates, or is this all straight affordable housing type projects?
Through the mayor, the projects that were looked at for this assessment are typically projects that have gone through Region of Waterloo.
Okay. To you.
Councillor Davey.
Sorry, I'm in for feedback.
No, not yet. Fernandez, Councillor, questions? Okay, Councillor March, you have no more questions? Okay, go ahead.
So what I want to understand better, based on an answer you gave earlier, is if a private developer were to apply to through a partnership with a nonprofit housing management organization, are you saying that that's not within the scope of what you... I heard you say that that's not in the scope of what you're proposing here today, but what I'm trying to understand is if we looked at that as an option, would that how would that change the scope of what you could bring back? How much time would it take and more complex?
Through the mayor, I think what I suggested is that we hadn't done a lot of research about setting up the program like that. However, if that is the discussion and direction from council on some of these questions that we have, that is something that could be built into how we define the eligibility criteria within that policy that comes back. So it could be possible to do that.
Yeah. I mean, is it, can you help me understand best practices for affordable housing units? We don't want to ghettoize whole areas or whole buildings through this process. So wouldn't we want to have affordable units mixed in with market rate units?
Through Mr. Mayor, that's the utopian view, yes.
Utopian? Whoa, utopian. It's not doable?
Through the mayor, it's a challenge, and I think that's why the province has come out with the Promoting Affordable Housing Act, where you can use more regulatory tools.
Sorry, can you just repeat the last phrase there? What?
It is often a challenge to do that in each municipality in the areas that are most desirable to do that, of having mixed income rental units. And especially in the planning process, we can't dictate how much a unit is sold or rented for, or even the tenure in terms of ownership or rental or whatnot. Through the new Promoting Affordable Housing Act, there would be the ability for municipalities, depending on how the regulations go, to finally get into that type of a thing, which is called inclusionary zoning, and some of the other tools that go with that.
Right, okay.
Those are pending.
Pending. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we now have 4 folks that want to start providing input. We can probably go till 10 after 5, roughly. And then we'll have to probably add this onto an agenda next committee day for some additional time, I'm thinking. But we'll work that out with staff. Councillor Fernandez, you were first in the queue.
Yeah, so just going to, do you want to just go through all the questions? Do you want me to give my input on everything?
All the questions would be helpful.
Okay.
Or any of the questions.
Okay. You know what, as far as the tax increment grant, I think it should be incremental, and I would like to see what the region does before we participate at that time. As far as the geographic locations, I'm a little bit hesitant to say, just LRT or transit corridors, because it isn't just transit corridors that are important. It's walkability to shopping and to schools and community centers, which are also very important. Those are oftentimes, affordable housing means that people have a set budget that they can pay for their rental property. That does not mean that they don't necessarily have a vehicle. So I think we need to take that into consideration as well. As far as application and building permits, yes, I think that this is where we could be focusing some of our attention, because just having seen the budget, we do know that our building is in a surplus. I don't think $25,000, which is what you're suggesting,